Okay, let's start. We're extremely fortunate and privileged to have Professor Gupta here share his view about China and India, what's the future of the two rising power in the world. And I don't have to talk a lot more about Professor Gupta. He's a very well-established scholar and distinguished, well-respected in academia and also, I think, in business world too. But I have a very good news to tell you. Professor Gupta just told me that he's coming to Singapore. He's going to take a senior position at the school INSEAD next January, so that's great. And yes. So.
Professor Huang, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. What I will do is take about 25 or 30 minutes to share my perspective on the China-India story. Of course, I should qualify by saying that I'm not a history or a political science expert. I teach at a business school, so what I know about are companies. That's the world I live in, the world of multinationals. And then, of course, you cannot be looking at companies without looking at industries and the overall economy. But my perspective is really not from the level of the countries and then going down, but at the level of companies and then going up to the level of industry and economy. And my subject is really global strategy. So that's my field. But in this day, and that's what I have been writing about for the last 20 years or more. But these days, nobody has a license to be talking about global strategy without a certain degree of expertise regarding China and India. So that's what pulled me into writing this book about getting China and India right. Also, this is where my personal and professional lives come together, because my co-author on this book is from China, Wang Haiyan, who also happens to be my wife. So therefore, for us, as an Indian and Chinese married to each other, that this was both a personal as well as a professional endeavor. And we picked the title of the book, Getting China and India Right, from basically because we work a lot with multinationals, both Haiyan and myself, and it originated from the observation that the vast majority, certainly of the American multinationals, and it's about half of the Fortune 500 are headquartered in the US, so we're talking about a fairly large number of the big multinationals in the world, that they know, obviously, there is no CEO who does not know about China and India. But knowing about China and India is not the same thing as knowing how to have the right strategy, right business strategy for these economies. It's a little bit like saying General Motors knows about the car industry. Obviously they do, but doesn't mean that they have the strategy for the car industry right. Or Microsoft knows about search, but doesn't mean that they have strategy for the search industry right. Or Sears about retailing. So therefore, knowing about China and India doesn't necessarily mean that they understand these economies well. And so it was that observation that led us to write this book and choose the title that we did, Getting China and India Right. So what I will do here is just, begin with the broad brush perspective and then go to the level of companies and business strategy. And hopefully we have plenty of time to get into a dialogue on this particular subject or, broader issues. So I start by looking at the China-India story within the broader context, because actually, while this is an important story, it's really part of a broader emerging market story. Certainly China and India are two of the biggest emerging economies, but the story is bigger than that. And the story really started around 1980. Before that, emerging economies, emerging markets used to be called third world. And what happened, why they are called emerging economies, is instead of just poor countries staying poor, they started to emerge. And that story started around 1980. And as is well accepted, well known, that the origins of that story, the forces propelling that story, the seeds, if you will, of that, the rise of emerging economies, was essentially a shift in ideology from the state to the market. And so therefore, entrepreneurial and innovation got unleashed, market forces got unleashed, be it in China, in India, in obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union, the shift from the state to the market in South America, other parts of the world. So that was a huge part of leading to a big rise in productivity domestically in virtually all the emerging economies. And as part of this shift in ideology from the state to the market, there was also a shift in ideology from isolation to global integration. And so all of that, and China clearly, 1978, and the Deng Xiaoping magic was a huge part of kickstarting this revolution, if you will. And so China and India are an important part of this broader story. And if you look at the top 24 economies in the world, which account for about 85% of the world's GDP, today 8 of the 24 are emerging economies. And the yellow marks are the emerging economies, and emerging economies are growing about 3 times faster than the developed economies. So if you think of the yellow marks as the emerging economies, the yellow marks are shifting to the left at a pretty rapid pace. It would not be surprising if by 2020, 2025, maybe 15 or 16 out of the top 24 economies were in fact emerging economies. China, as we know already, is the 3rd largest economy in the world, and before too long it will be the 2nd largest. The recent economic crisis that all of us have witnessed and lived through and probably suffered from in some fashion or the other has clearly affected China and India as well. But if you look at the figures, it's clear that while China's growth rate has come down by about 2%, India's has come down by about 2%, the West has come down to either to negative, or this year many countries might just about break even. That actually the economic crisis, while it has affected all economies, has actually accelerated the pace with which China and India close the gap in terms of the size of the economies with the developed world. So here is, let's say, another way to think about what the future might bring. So if you look at year 2007, the top 8 emerging economies, so it is, for the moment, let's call them the E8, the total GDP at market exchange rates, so not adjusted for purchasing power parity, is roughly about $10 trillion, US dollars. And the top 8 developed economies at market exchange rates, the GDP is about $30 trillion. So that's where, let's say, the starting point. Now I said, okay, let's make some assumptions. Let's assume that the D8, the 8 developed economies, the US, Japan, Germany, and the like, they grow at 2% a year. Let's assume that as an aggregated group, the E8 grow at 6% a year. We don't know, but 6 is a slower growth rate than what most people are projecting, most economists are projecting about both for China and India, which are clearly 2 of the biggest emerging economies. So I said, let's be a little bit conservative. Let's assume 6% a year. And let's then make 3 different assumptions, that there is no adjustment in currencies, or that as a basket, the emerging economies currency appreciates at 2% a year, or that it appreciates at 4% a year. So those are 3 different assumptions about. And essentially, and I said, let's assume that the currency appreciation, if it happens, would happen until 2025, and thereafter there would be no currency adjustment. So let's look at what does this indicate. And what it yields is to basically the following picture. Depending on what assumption one makes, that by either 2020 or 2035, somewhere in that particular time frame, the 8 largest emerging economies become bigger as a group in terms of GDP than the 8 largest developed economies, right? So therefore, once again, it goes to show that the China-India phenomenon, obviously it's very powerful, but it's part of a bigger emerging market story, which includes Brazil and Indonesia and Russia and the like. And in fact, this shift in power from the West to the East, from the developed to the emerging economies, is happening at a very rapid rate, and is probably the biggest structural transformation in world economy after the early 19th century, at which time, the baton got passed from China and India, which were the 2 biggest economies, to Europe and then to America. And now, in some ways, we can say it's a back to the future kind of story. And this is reflected, because obviously economies consist of industries, and so whatever we might say at the level of economies, if it is not reflected at the level of specific industries, clearly there is some problem with our projection. So, I look at what's happening in many industries, and I just picked one major industry for virtually every economy, the auto industry. And look at the pace of change. As here I have data on production, but data on demand is not all that different from data on production, is that in 1999, just among the top 12 countries, 12 auto countries, auto markets in the world, the emerging economies produced 1/10 the number of cars that the developed economies did. Only 9 years later, the emerging economies produced half as many cars. So it has gone within 9 years from 1/10 to half. By 2020, there is every prediction that the emerging economies among the top 12 will be producing more cars than the developed, that within about maybe 2 to 3 years, China will be the biggest market in the auto sector in the world. So we can see this. You can look at pharmaceuticals, you can look at retailing, industry after industry after industry, the figures hold up. Now, so that's sort of as a broad brush. Then I look at, how I make sense of China and India. And there are many, many lenses that one could bring to this subject. What is the China story? What is the India story? How similar are they? How different are they? What is the nature of interrelationship between China and India? What are the areas of cooperation? What are the areas of competition? How well do the multinationals understand? So there are many, many lenses. And so what I do is, for the sake of time, just pick a few of the lenses to share some of the top highlights. So as a broad brush perspective, the China and India, as the two oldest civilizations on Earth, have had actually a history of harmonious relationship until the recent few decades. So therefore, if we go back in the long kind of arm of history, we know about the travel of Buddhism from India to China, but also academic, intellectual linkages. In the 8th century, it's been recorded. An Indian scientist was appointed as the president of China's Board of Astronomy. And of course, we know about Zheng He's travels to India from China. And as is also well known, from 1950s onwards, there was big, massive turmoil. There was perhaps naivete on India's part, as has been well recorded, on India's prime minister at that time, Nehru's part. And then there was a border war. And after that, essentially, things came to a complete freeze, what one might call cold peace, where the two sides have no connection with each other at all, like two ships passing in the night. From the late 1990s, what we have now is a new reality. So finally, in 1991, India jumped onto the same train of economic reform and liberalization, global integration that China started in 1978. And finally, India began to realize that, boy, China is becoming an economic superpower. And, it's like the competition between Coke and Pepsi, that the Pepsi people acknowledge that the presence of Coke is very good for them, and vice versa, that the competition, if you will, or the sense that China is moving ahead, has generally, I think, been good for India. It has given India a sense of urgency in terms of making its own economy grow at a rapid rate. So that's, and my own perception is I've been traveling to China for the last 13, 14 years. I go 3-4 times a year. So I've, of course, not only relatives in China, but many business colleagues, academic friends. I've done consulting for Chinese companies. So I interact a lot. And my own sense is that essentially China ignored India or wrote off India until about, say, 2004, 2005. And at that point, sort of a beginning of an acceptance that perhaps India might also make it. Whereas in the last 12 months, 18 months, I think that realization is beginning to become more deeply accepted. And I can see that just by the number of articles about India that appear in Chinese press, the number of times that I'm called by some Chinese media to talk about my perspective on what's happening in India for the Chinese audience and so on. So I can see that, that there is a growing acceptance within China that perhaps India also will become an economic superpower. And now there is a very active, what I would say, cooperation, which is both cooperation and competition, harmony as well as tensions coexisting at the same time. I'll talk a little more about that. Now, I'm often asked as somebody who writes about China and India, and particularly when people don't know that I'm married to a woman from China, is that the general assumption is that China and India are just vastly different. It's like they are people from cultures from two different planets, right? And actually, yesterday I had an interview by telephone with a Chinese media, and again on the same subject about really, can Chinese and Indians get along, kind of a thing, because they are so different, aside from the border issues and the like. And I made a statement which I really believe in, that actually Chinese and Indians are more similar, far more similar than Chinese and Japanese are. Okay. Which actually to the reporter was quite a surprise. Because I said that what happens is that the Chinese and Japanese look very similar on the surface. But cultures and values are not what appears on the surface. In fact, a very good friend of mine is a Japanese anthropology professor at Tokyo University, so obviously he can be trusted to know Japan. And he made an observation to me about 15 years back at a conference here in Singapore. We were both together and having dinner. He said, you know what, it's a very interesting thing that's going on. I said, what? He said, you know, in Japan, you have communists working in a capitalist system. In China, you have capitalists working in a communist system. Okay? So fundamentally, in terms of, you know, hardcore values, Chinese and Japanese are very different. Chinese are individualists. Indians are individualists. And so on. So therefore, that actually, you know, my own perspective is that China, India, it's about 70-30, 70 common, 30 different. On the surface, they look very different. Obviously, physical features are different. They eat different kinds of food. They speak very different languages. But fundamentally, at the core, most of the values are hugely common. And I won't go through, you know, all of these details, but you know, massive, you know, two biggest economies, two most populous countries, the two fastest growing economies. For 2,000 years, they were the two largest. By 2050, they will be the two largest again. They are simultaneously rich and poor, you know. They are two of the top 10, top 12 economies in the world. But at the same time, China ranks below number 100 in terms of per capita income, right? So they both have two of the largest number of billionaires in the world, but they also have two of the largest number of poor people in the world. So they're both extremely poor, but at the same time, scientifically, technologically very advanced. So there are many, many huge commonalities between the two, even at the level of culture. That in terms of fundamentals such as the centrality of faith, preserving the other person's dignity in a public context, the value accorded to family, to children, to education, to savings, to investment, etc., the values are virtually identical. But at the same time, I don't want to minimize very important salient differences between China and India. I start on the economic front. And I like to understand the economic differences between China and India in the form of two equations. One is I equals C times, or C equals I times 3, which is China's GDP is about 3 times, slightly more than 3 times that of India. Okay? And that's an important difference. 3 times is a fairly big difference. But just like distance between any 2 points can be measured in terms of kilometers or miles, or it can be measured in terms of time, how long it takes to get there. Similarly, economic distance can be measured in terms of magnitude or in terms of time. So if we take, for instance, India's GDP of 2007, China's GDP of 2007 or 2008, and we assume that India's GDP will grow at 8%. Not an unreasonable assumption, given that even in this year, 2009, which is about the worst year out of the last 10 years, India's GDP is expected to grow between 6.5% to 7%. And so therefore, if India's, and next year it might grow at 9. Still have to see, but 9 is not out of the possibility for next year for India. So if we assume that India's GDP grows at 8%, essentially what happens is that by 2020, India's GDP will be as large as China's GDP of 2008 or 2007. So I'm not saying that India will catch up with China. I think that would be foolish, just simply wrong, because China would have powered ahead. But the gap between China and India, by gap meaning not a gap that India will close, but in terms of how far India is behind China economically, that it's about 12, 13, 14 years. Essentially, China mounted a very spectacular and impressive Beijing 2008 Olympics. And of course, to mount that kind of a spectacular show, you need economic power, you need the ability to spend tons of money, and of course, you need organization. I think India will always be more chaotic than China is, but by 2020 or 2024, India will have the money to launch a New Delhi 2020 or New Delhi 2024 that comes close to a Beijing 2008. So that's how I see. Of course, there are other important differences. We know about China's dominance over India in manufacturing. China's GDP 3 times that of India. Manufacturing sector is about 5 to 6 times that of India. On the other hand, India is far ahead of China in IT-related services. The biggest IT company out of China has 10,000 people. In India, it would be company number 20 that has 10,000 people. The big companies have 100,000 people. So therefore, just like China is trying to catch up in IT and so on, but it's not anytime soon that China catches up, India does not anytime soon catches up with China in manufacturing. India has a huge demographic advantage, perhaps. We could say certainly it's 8 years younger than China. And so that actually leads to an interesting speculation, is that, China is the fastest aging society in the world. Therefore, and of course, as old age dependency ratios rise, it will impose a tax on the economy. So could it be that from 2015 onwards, China, if you will, has to pay a demography tax? India today, we could say, perhaps pays a democracy tax, right? And so the 2% difference in the growth rates between China and India perhaps could be attributed to government inefficiencies in China. We could call that a democracy tax in economic terms. Could it be that from 2015 onwards, there is a demography tax that China has to pay, okay? And there's nothing that policymakers in China can do about it, because demography is demography and it's going to play out, irrespective of any policies on the part of the Chinese government today. So therefore, it's not unlikely that maybe in 5, 7, 8 years from now, China's growth rate is at par with, maybe who knows, even ahead of China. Because what really India lacks today is physical infrastructure. Already, India's manufacturing costs are lower than China's. India's engineering capabilities are very good. I wouldn't say they are ahead of China, but they're certainly very, very good. What India lacks is poor infrastructure, and the infrastructure revolution in India has begun the way it had begun in China in 1996. Also, another thing that I would like to say is that the Indian companies, so if you compare the economy advantage, macroeconomy advantage China, on almost every measure, 3 times faster growth rate, etc. But if we look at the level of companies, the world where I spend a lot of my time in, and if we take the top 100 companies out of the biggest 100 companies out of India, the biggest 100 companies out of China, and somehow if somebody could create a Jack Welch index of corporate leadership, and we could administer that kind of a survey or some kind of a measure, I think the Indian companies on the Jack Welch index of corporate leadership are likely to come out far ahead of Chinese companies. Most Indian companies are private sector. Most big Chinese companies are state-owned, and that makes a big difference. Also, Indian culture, democracy, much more diverse use of English language, which means that Indian corporate leaders, as they're growing up, are far more adept at managing horizontally, managing across diversity, than is currently the case with Chinese corporate leaders. So I could go on, but in fact, the head of McKinsey, the big consulting firm in China, is a very close friend of mine. And I was talking to him last year. I said, when Chorus, the Anglo-Dutch steel company, was on the market, Tata Steel obviously acquired it, but Brazilian steel company, Severstal from Russia, they were also bidders. How come Bao Steel from China was not a bidder? One would have expected, because Chinese companies obviously have global ambitions. And the Chinese government has global ambitions for Chinese companies. How come they were not a bidder? And he said, well, as the head of McKinsey, he said, yeah, actually, we work with Bao Steel. And I know the story. He says, they looked at it, but they said, we don't have a clue what we would do after we acquired it. And so this is clearly a case where in many Chinese companies, there is a realization that we don't currently have the organizational capability to run global enterprises in the way Tata Steel or Tata Motors or others do. So I think if I say macroeconomy, clear advantage to China, microeconomy, I would be inclined to say an advantage to India. Clearly radically different political systems, and also culturally, I think China is a much more pragmatic society. And I can certainly say, see that in my own home. And India is more spiritual, I think, in that sense, which, make for some difficult interactions, because it's possible that Chinese can be more cutthroat than Indians. So at least that's been my observation. Then moving beyond the similarities and differences, that if I'm talking to say a senior executive, a CEO of a Western multinational, And I get into those dialogues about how should we try to understand China and India. At the top level, the perspective that I advocate is to think of each of these two countries as four stories playing out at the same time. Each of these four stories would be strategically compelling in its own right. But the fact that all four are playing out together makes these particularly powerful. And there is no other third economy in the world, not even Brazil or Russia, where all four stories are playing out at the same time. So story number one is mega markets and mega growth. And that we talked about earlier. Story number two is that even though these are large, rapidly growing economies, they are two of the poorest economies in the world, which makes them two of the lowest cost economies in the world. If you look at blue-collar costs in tier one manufacturing locations like Suzhou Industrial Park in China or Gurgaon in Delhi or in India, the labor costs are $150 an hour or $250 an hour, respectively. US, you're talking more than $20 an hour. White-collar, national average cost of a software programmer, India $15,000, China $20,000, US we're talking about $90,000. So therefore still, despite all the run-up in wages, white-collar, blue-collar over the last 10 years, the cost arbitrage opportunities are huge, right? And if you look at Accenture, they have 40,000 people in India, 95% working on global projects. Assume a cost difference per employee of about 40,000. You're talking that Accenture, by having 40,000 people in India, is saving about $1.6 billion a year. And that's material, even for a big company like Accenture. Third story playing out is that even though these are the two poorest economies in the world, they are actually rapidly becoming hubs for innovation by various measures. So I just picked two relevant measures. One is the output of scientists and engineers, that China and India produce the two largest number of scientists and engineers every year, and numbers that are rising. Whereas the third largest in terms of numbers, US, we would expect the numbers to be more or less steady. But another interesting is we look at patents. And here I looked at the toughest measure of patents, which is patents granted, not applications filed, but patents granted by the US Patent Trademark Office, right? Of course, it takes not many years for an application to be approved. And if you look at the first, China and India are the two fastest growing, China-India origin patents are the two fastest growing by number. But if you look at, say, China figure, and we project it to grow at between 20-25% a year, by 2020, China origin patents granted by USPTO will exceed those from Germany, France, UK, and Italy combined. So therefore, by many measures, China and India are becoming seriously important global hubs for innovation. There are other poor countries like Vietnam and Philippines, for example, which have very low cost structures, but they're not yet technological powerhouses in the way China or India are. There are other technological powerhouses like Germany and Japan, but they don't have the cost structure of a China or India. The fourth story is the rise of dragons and tigers. It's the Huawei and Haier and Lenovo and Alibaba and Tata Motors and Infosys and Wipro and Suzlon, companies like that. We saw this story play out, Sony, Samsung, Nissan, LG from Japan and South Korea. What's different in the China-India case is that if you look at Toyota, for instance, you look at Nissan, you look at Sony, virtually entire global expansion and growth was organic. Stealing 0.25% market share, this year and next year. And even then, Toyota went from basically a domestic Japanese company in the 1970s to being the global giant that it is today within about 40 years, right? The global champions that are emerging from China and India are going to do and already doing that through inorganic means, through acquisitions. And so therefore, because acquisitions can make companies larger at a much faster pace, these global champions, the dragons and tigers, are likely to alter the structures of their industries in 10 years, what Toyota and Sony did over a period of 40 years. And this is happening across industries, high-tech, low-tech, service, and manufacturing. So these are the four stories that are playing out. And we can look at, anecdotal examples, whether it is Tata Motors or BYD's, hybrid auto or the electric auto and the like. If you look at Fortune 500 companies, global 500 companies, there were only 5 out of China and India in 1995. Today it is 44. Not unlikely at all that by 2020 there could be 150 companies from China and India in the Global 500, probably larger than those from the US. So once again, we can see this across the board. Back to the future story. I'll skip that because we already covered that part. Another story, which is not widely recognized, but very, very true. It's almost like below the radar from the perspective of the media and even a lot of companies, is a story of increasing economic cooperation, economic ties between these two countries. If you look at the growth of trade between China and India, okay? Now, world trade over the last 7 years, 8 years, has grown at about 12% a year. China-India trade has been growing at between 45 to 50% a year, 4 times faster. China's trade with the rest of the world has been growing at about 23, 24% a year. India's trade with the rest of the world has been growing at about 23, 24% a year. China-India trade has been growing at twice that rate. In fact, if China-India trade of 2008 were to continue growing at not 45, 50% a year, but only 25% a year between now and 2015, China-India trade in 2015 will be as large as China-US trade today. So essentially, what we are talking about is the China-India trade linkages becoming extremely powerful, and by 2020, every reason to believe that China-India trade links will be among the top 10 biggest bilateral trade links of any two countries in the world. So that's an important story. Many factors that are driving this, but at the same time, aside from the growing economic linkages, there are serious tensions that persist, both economic tensions as well as geopolitical tensions. Yes, there is competition for geopolitical power. The unresolved border disputes that are well known, and in fact, Professor Huang knows a whole lot more about that subject than I do. Trade, while there are trade linkages that bring the two countries closer together, India runs a trade deficit with China, just as many other economies do. And that doesn't sit well with certain sectors in India. Obviously, it sits very well with those who are the importers from China, but it doesn't sit well from those companies that Chinese imports essentially compete with. There is competition, if you will, for just prestige and respect. Ego, for example, that there are a lot of Chinese and Indians immigrants in the U.S. and Indians in general have done better than Chinese immigrants have done at rising, to corporate CEO positions in big companies like Citigroup or PepsiCo and the like. There's, of course, competition for prestige and respect in terms of acquisitions. If Tata Motors can buy Jaguar Land Rover, why can't Geely buy Volvo? So those kinds of stories get played out. Not always irrational. So I'm not saying that these are irrational, but certainly those things are playing out. And yes, there is competition over natural resources. So where might China and India be in 2020? Generally, my view is that while the tensions will remain, like tensions between Japan and China, between France and Germany, between China and the US, so it's unlikely that the tensions between China and India will go away. But at the same time, the ties that bring the two countries together economically, but also on other sides, for example, over climate issues, over trade issues in the World Trade Organization, over agriculture subsidies, rich versus developed economies, that China and India are finding increasingly common ground on a number of issues. And we have to see how things play out. But over the last few days, the Japanese Prime Minister mooted the idea of an East Asia bloc that would bring countries together. So I think that story is probably going to play out, but we have to see. And I will just take one slide and then maybe not go any further, and then leave open the floor for a dialogue with Professor Huang and with all of you. So if this is the China-India story, how prepared companies are, and here I talk about the Western multinationals, how prepared are they to engage with this reality, okay? And if you look at, so external reality I talked about, the various numbers, but look at the internal reality in companies. On the right side of this slide, you see the results of a survey from Boston Consulting Group of large Western companies. And senior executives, they accept that Asia accounts for 34% of the potential market. But then you look at exactly what percent of the top 200 leaders in the companies are from Asia. essentially what's happening is that the vast majority of Western multinationals, while they are aware of the rise of Asia, they're still looking at Asia from the lens of the West, right? And that's, very much like in Microsoft looking at the search industry in 2001 from the lens of the desktop PC, okay? You're aware of it, but being aware of it doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to engage with it, And so I think that's the story, and, that we deal with in this book. But in a sentence, what we say is that the way to engage with China and India from a corporate strategy point of view is to think of these two as obviously countries, economies, industries that are joining the global network. But instead of joining the global network as two nodes, they are actually joining the global network as two hubs. And it's different when two economies join as nodes of a network versus join as hubs of the network. And essentially, if they join as hubs, it has implications for political power, not in a geopolitical sense, but political power within the company, within a Cisco, within a Procter & Gamble, within a Walmart. Exactly, does power sit at Summers, New York, or San Jose, California, or Bentonville, Arkansas? Or does real decision-making power to allocate resources move to this region? And that's the internal struggle that a lot of companies are going through. So that's sort of one implication, is that, internal political restructuring within companies. And the second lesson for companies is that the right strategy for China and India is really to understand that these are four realities that are playing out at the same time: market and growth, cost, innovation, and competition. And that the right strategy is one that embraces all four of these realities head on. So that's sort of in summary form, some of the major ideas that we bring out in the book. So with that, maybe we can open for discussion. Professor Huang?
Yeah, it's a great, very enlightening lecture. I learned a great deal, and I know that a lot of people want to ask questions, so I will take advantage. Ask you first question. We know that, I agree that India and China get into economic convergence, as you has very powerfully very convincingly argued. But my question is that the two countries still have some political problems between them. There are political suspicion, strategic suspicion, diplomatic tensions, and so on and so forth. To what extent do you think this economic convergence can help to overcome strategic suspicion, or can help to improve the political relations down the road?
That's a very, very, very critical, actually, point. The maybe two or three ways in which I would try to answer that question. First is that, if I may just qualify, that instead of saying economic convergence, I might use the word economic integration. Convergence would imply that India will catch up with China. I don't think India will catch up with China in the next 30, 40 years, because China is 3 times that of India. But India is, 12, 13, 14 years behind, so it's not like 100 years behind. So in that sense, but economic integration for sure. Looking at Europe, perhaps is an interesting starting point, is that, I've been going to Europe, and I go as a visiting professor from time to time. I've done consulting for European companies. I've been going to Europe from about 1984, every year, 2-3 times. And as I've followed the emergence of European integration, and it's well accepted that the integration of Europe was not led by the political leaders. It actually was led by corporate leaders. The politicians were dragged into it kicking and screaming, because politicians do not want to give up their national identities, the autonomy, the political autonomy of the country. But it's the companies in France and Italy and UK that did not have the scale, the European scale, to compete with the American and the Japanese giants. And so the companies felt the need to have European scale, the need for the decline of borders, or of friction in doing business across borders. So essentially, that integration was led by the companies and industries, and then the politicians jumped on board. And I think that similarly, in the case of India and China, I would hope that the corporate leaders on both sides will continue to play out their magic, if you will, because as the economic integration continues to proceed ahead, that will become a force for moderation of the politicians on both sides. And because I would suspect that politicians on both sides listen to what their corporate leaders have to say and what the economic interests of their countries are, and that it will therefore become a glue rather than further friction. But I should add one more thing on this is, I've interacted with a lot of people from China and the corporate side and a lot of people from India on the corporate side at senior levels. And I would say, unfortunately, there is very poor understanding among the Indian corporate leaders about China and among Chinese corporate leaders about India. So I think, and what happens is that when people don't understand, then that breeds mistrust. That breeds suspicion, even though there may not necessarily be an objective basis for that mistrust. So I think that to the extent economic integration is likely to be a leading edge force before political harmony, if you will, that I think anything that any of us can do to increase just mere understanding among Indian corporate leaders about China and vice versa would be good.
Okay, thank you. I used to say I'm optimistic about bilateral relations. Chopra knows that. But now you make me even more optimistic. And I think the floor is open for questions, and so everybody has a chance here. Please.
Yeah, I have a question with regard to governance, and I do mean corporate governance or no public governance. So what I see is here, while you can say that there are levels of corruption, that occur in both countries, I see a stark difference between failure of governance by the government in India versus China. And I'd like you to talk specifically in terms of the effect of that, because for the most part, you assume the power of compounding in a lot of your extrapolations, and you take the conservative rate. My question is that rate of 20-25% sustainable in 15 years in the case of India? What is the impact of public governance on sustaining that rate? And is the escape point the fact that public governance becomes increasingly irrelevant in India's growth?
Yeah.
So I'd just like you to focus on public governance and its impact on the economy growth over 10, 15 years.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's, of course, one would have no reason to disagree with the idea that public governance, or essentially the working of the government in India is generally, in terms of government efficiency, political efficiency, we would give it a score of 2 or 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. So it basically stinks. I think that's a fair enough statement. It's not just corruption, but it doesn't work. So while I would agree with that statement, I wouldn't necessarily be too pessimistic about the implications of that governance situation for India's economic growth, for 2 reasons. Number one is that just like in China, economic growth did not take place simultaneously at the same pace throughout China. It started on the East Coast, and then now it's moving west. Because a huge country like China, you cannot really have reforms of various types, including, say, the creation of special economic zones or infrastructure in the whole country at one time. So in China, again, it started in pockets and then is spreading through the rest of the country. Similarly, in India, actually, in India even more than in China, the different states, the provinces, actually have a lot more political power in India than, say, the states in the US do. And if you look at India's states, yes, UP, Bihar, etc., have generally a track record of horrible governance. But there are other states, like Gujarat, like Rajasthan, and other Haryana, which have generally had a very good record of governance. And so, just like in the case of China, that there are states in India that are at the leading edge. And increasingly, we begin to see states competing with each other for investment, domestic investment, not just foreign investment. So therefore, the good virus, if you will, is likely to spread in the case of India. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say about India is that In China, the government, in general, because it's very effective, does a lot of things. Creation of public good, if you will, whether it's education or infrastructure or health. In India, the government generally doesn't work as effectively. But fortunately, in India, private sector steps in to do a lot of the things extremely effectively and efficiently that the government does in China. So, for instance, what we are beginning to see in the education sector, like things like whether it's microfinance or the emerging, still in the early stages, using the internet for bringing basic education to the villages, etc. And a lot of that is going to be private sector driven. So I think that the failings of the government in India, to some extent, are partly compensated by the efficiency of the private sector. So, still, I'm not saying that governance is not an issue, but I wouldn't be as pessimistic about it as one would be by giving it a rank of a score of 2 or 3.
Okay, thank you. And for those who want to ask questions, please come to behind the microphone because we are doing the recording. Please.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Venkat. I'm from Singapore Management University. Thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. My question links up 3 points that you brought up. One is the similarity between India and China, and probably even between Indians and Chinese. Second was about the growth in the trade, which is, you pointed out, in the last 8 years has grown up about 25 times. And the third is about knowing the opportunities, not understanding. My question is, Singapore for the last 10 years has been trying to play a role in the India-China trade, right? Question is, in the next 10 years, when this growth in India-China bilateral trade expands or probably will accelerate, do you foresee a role for Singapore in that? Has there been a significant role in the last 8-10 years? Do you foresee one in the next 10 years? Thank you.
Yeah, that's the. Actually, I would just modify the question a little bit. Perhaps you will agree with me, which is that when we look at economic ties between two countries, between India and China, trade is obviously one important dimension. The other important dimension is investment, direct investment. And I think that Singapore's role in fostering trade between China and India perhaps would be less important than Singapore's role in fostering investment ties between China and India. And I think that's the way it is likely to happen. For example, we can already see, I just give a couple of examples, that normally China is not very receptive to foreign companies from any country playing within its steel sector. So it's a relatively speaking protected sector, if not officially, then in real on-the-ground terms. But Tata Steel is a player in China's steel industry because Tata Steel acquired Max Steel, which is headquartered here. There's another company, Punch Lloyd, which is in infrastructure, which has a huge Singapore headquartered subsidiary, which is a big player in China's infrastructure. And so essentially that one way in which Indian companies are making an investment route to China is by using Singapore, by using ASEAN as like a bridge between the two sides. So I think that's a very important role. And of course, on the trade side also, that both China and India are talking to ASEAN in terms of, free trade agreements, and the discussions that are taking place about enlarging the trade zone, perhaps creating an East Asia bloc. All of that will foster trade between China and India, and Singapore is an extremely influential player in those discussions. So I think that's how I would see it would play out. And also another thing is that integration between China and India is not just actually direct integration because Indian companies export to or import from or invest in or have investments from China or vice versa. That's one type of linkage between the two. But an extremely important type of economic linkage between China and India is by third country companies, meaning GE has huge investments in India and huge investments in China. But GE does not have a China strategy which is isolated from an India strategy. GE has an integrated Asia strategy of which China and India are actually hugely integrated parts. Same with IBM, same with Microsoft, and so on. But to the extent that Singaporean companies, whether it is Temasek or real estate companies, are active in both China and India, they bring the two countries together. So I think multiple dimensions.
Please.
Charles from the East-West Group. If I may, I'd like to ask 3 questions. First of all, the first question is the Indian and Chinese diaspora. What are your views on their contribution to the advancement of these two countries, the Indian and Chinese diaspora? Second question, you mentioned about the promotion of understanding between China and India. China now has the Confucius Institute distributed worldwide. What is India doing? And if the Chinese were to be able to speak better English, I'm quite sure they move much, much faster than what they are now doing. My third question is ASEAN. You mentioned this special number 2015, 2020. Now, how would this India-China aspect have an impact on our ASEAN economic community? We're supposedly half the population of China. That's what we're trying to do. But because everything is rising so fast now, and this will have an impact on countries like Indonesia, right? Maybe have your views on that, please.
Yeah. The first question is about the diaspora. First, of course, the U.S. as being the biggest, one of the biggest places where you have both Chinese and Indian diaspora. Clearly, of course, there is diaspora in Southeast Asia from both China and India, or Australia. But for the moment, if I look at the U.S. case, that there are actually hard figures that people have collected, like Anil out of UC Berkeley, that the Indians and Chinese entrepreneurs in the technology sector have been the two most important players in the development of new ventures in venture capital. In fact, in Silicon Valley, the joke is that Silicon Valley is built on ICs, which of course could stand for integrated circuits, or it could stand for Indians and Chinese. So they have been very successful. And actually, they're both playing a hugely important role in fostering the growth of China and India. Because it's like what happened in the case of Taiwan, that the semiconductor industry of Taiwan was really built by the linkages that the Taiwanese immigrants had in the U.S. at major companies like Intel or IBM and at major universities, and of course the Taiwanese government's attempt to build a semiconductor industry in Taiwan. And the same thing that India's IT sector, for instance, gets a huge advantage because the top runs, it's like the top 6 people out of the top 20 in Microsoft, in Redmond, Washington, at the corporate headquarters are of Indian origin. Some of the top executives at Texas Instruments, at IBM, at Intel are of Indian heritage. And so, or at lots of other companies. And so that clearly increases an understanding at the level of top companies about the potential of India and how those companies could leverage India. And, it's well known that India's IT sector, for instance, actually was kick-started in the mid-1980s, not really by Indian companies, but by GE and McKinsey. So multinational companies and Indians in multinational companies have played a huge role. But the same thing is that if we look at China, of course, so far China's rise has been driven very heavily by manufacturing efficiency. But if you look at what's the next game that China needs to play, it's the innovation game. It's moving up in technology. Also, China needs to globalize its companies. And both in terms of moving up on the innovation ladder and in terms of globalizing, that it's actually the returning Chinese that are likely to play a huge role, whether by returning to the universities at Beida or Tsinghua or Fudan, or by returning, for instance, if you look at Chery Auto, the executive vice president in charge of the international business of Chery Auto, Dr. Zhang Lin, Chinese American. He was with Daimler Chrysler for about 14 years, PhD from Michigan, and now returned back to China. So I think the diaspora in both countries is playing a huge role and will play a great role. The second question that you had was about
Confucius.
Yeah, Confucius. India is doing nothing. I think that's probably the Confucius Institutes are actually, there is one at my own university, University of Maryland, so I'm well aware of that phenomenon. as best as I can see, Indian government is doing nothing on that. Probably the Indian equivalent of Confucius Institute will be Bollywood.
Or yoga.
I think that's the honest answer. In my view, sorry? Nalanda. But I think that's certainly a very ambitious idea. But it's going to be very hard to make it real. It's going to be very hard to make it real, you know. I mean, as it is to take Beda or Tsinghua or one of the IITs and make them really world-class is a big challenge. You cannot do it in 10 years. So create from scratch a world-class university is even harder, you know. Yeah, so that's, yeah. Yeah, the ASEAN, I think in some sense I would say I don't have too much clarity on that subject right now as to what the implications are for ASEAN. But, you know, I mean, ASEAN has been growing at about 5% a year. You know, again, not every country is growing at the same rate, but on average, you know, China has been growing at 10, 11, India at maybe 8, you know, ASEAN has been growing about 4 to 5, and so on. So, and again, you know, ASEAN is a huge economy, and so it's a big market for China. It's a big market for India. It's a bridge for Indian companies to China, at least, you know, some Indian companies we can see. But beyond that, I haven't actually analyzed that in too much detail, so I don't have great clarity on that subject.
Okay, next.
Hi, Professor. I'm an MPB student in the school, and I have 2 questions. Professor, you talked about Jaguar Land Rover. I happen to work for Jaguar Land Rover in China. And I remember that when the rumors came out that Tata is going to acquire Jaguar Land Rover, the sales plunged in China. And the customers are worried that their cars may smell like curry. Sorry. So my question is, okay, let's forget about the economics. Let's face the stigma that both China and India is facing. So how do you think that China and India perhaps build the China and Indian brand? So my second question is, as a Chinese, I felt that China is overmanaged but underled. And India, my perception is perhaps overled but undermanaged. So is that perception true? And what do you think they can learn from each other? Thank you.
Yeah, a very, very interesting question. I would say, well, first of all, the Jaguar Land Rover story, I think that has a very clean answer. And do you know Chris Brown? Yeah, so Chris Brown, he's the president of Jaguar Land Rover China. Actually, he's my former student. So I know the Jaguar Land Rover story in China quite well by talking to Chris. And the sales actually, I mean, there were fears at that time that because of the stigma that now it's an Indian company, the sales will go down. But sales have been actually roaring ahead. Clearly, of course, affected by the downturn or the slowdown in the economy last year. But the sales have actually not suffered. They continue to power ahead. So the reality has turned out to be not bad at all. There were fears in the US too. And I think the Tatas have managed the Jaguar Land Rover integration extremely well because what they have done is to kept Jaguar Land Rover as a British company with headquarters in Britain, led by English executives and not led by Indians. In fact, the CEO of Tata Motors in India, I also know him very well. He was my classmate. So this is a case where I know the inside perspective by talking to close friends. And what they have done is that the CEO of Tata Motors actually does not have authority over Jaguar Land Rover. Although he's called CEO of Tata Motors, he's actually responsible for all Tata Motors activities other than Jaguar Land Rover. So therefore, by preserving the English identity and the English headquarters, they have essentially mitigated those issues. And if Geely acquires Volvo, for example, it would be very wise for Geely to follow the same approach and keep Volvo as a Swedish company rather than make it into a Chinese company. So I think that part. The second thing, you made the point about Chinese companies as being overmanaged, underled, Indian companies overled, undermanaged. I think that's generally is, I would entirely agree with that perspective. And both sides have a lot to learn, but both are learning at a very, very rapid rate. So I think, that in terms of how to manage large global enterprises, Chinese companies are behind, but they will learn.
Okay, you have to go. Yeah, she first. Okay. We have last 3 questions because Professor Gupta is extremely busy and fully booked. Go ahead.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Shabnam Siddiqui, and I'm a PhD student at the LKY school. My question is regarding since India and China do not act in isolation in the global economy, the growing kind of ties that the two countries that your analysis is predicting, what could be the role of the developed economies, especially the US, European Union, and also what would be the role of the expats in forging or leading to disintegration of these kind of ties?
Yeah, I think the role of developed economies. One could come at it from 2 or 3 different perspectives. So one would be that I think basically there is very little, if anything, that developed economies can do to prevent the rise of China and India. Henry Kissinger, sometime over the last couple of years, is said to have remarked, there is nothing we can do to prevent the rise of China. There is nothing we should do to prevent the rise of China. The only option we have is to figure out how to engage with the rising China. And one would say the same thing about a rising India. So I think, so that's number one. Secondly, any economy, and particularly so in the case of the developed economies, ultimately consist of industries which consist of companies. So therefore, when I think about, so what role will companies like IBM and Unilever and Procter & Gamble and Nokia play? And what's really happening is that these companies, particularly the smart ones, are rapidly morphing themselves so that while they remain an American or a European company, they are by every measure also becoming at the same time a Chinese company and an Indian company. So take IBM as a case in point, that IBM has 360,000 people worldwide. 100,000 out of 360,000 are based in India, larger than the number of IBM employees in the US. So therefore, and those are not clerical workers. I mean, they are IT computer scientists. And so therefore, IBM, in many ways, is very much an Indian company. At the same time, IBM is in hardware business, and 1/3 of IBM's hardware is manufactured in China. The chief procurement officer for IBM worldwide sits in Shenzhen. And so therefore, IBM is also in many ways a Chinese company. And I think what's happening is that the big Western multinationals, the good ones, the smart ones, are rapidly morphing themselves and becoming a part of this fabric. And so therefore, what these companies do, they integrate the developed and the emerging economies. They integrate China and India with each other. And I think that role is likely to keep playing out.
My question stems from the fact that you're a leading academic in the Western world and that you regularly move to India and China on consulting projects and are about to be based with INSEAD in Singapore. A lot of management thought, and I say management in a broad sense, in marketing strategy, whatever, is, as we know it, has been Western-oriented. Going forward, what role, in view of the economic shift to the East, would management thought emanate from the East? And I take the India to Japan, China corridor, that it's very often touted as, for instance, a Singapore university with a global perspective. What is going to be their value add going forward?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I do have an answer to that, although personally, I wouldn't be bothered if no good idea came from China or India on the management side in the next 30 years at all. The reason I wouldn't be bothered is because ideas are public good. And so it doesn't matter which corner of the world a good management idea emerges. essentially it gets adopted and nobody can have a monopoly on a good idea. So therefore the country where the idea originates actually is not the only one that benefits from it. Ultimately it becomes a public good. So if you think about total quality management, just-in-time manufacturing, Kanban, all of that originated from Japan, but really actually have become global ideas. So therefore it doesn't particularly bother me. But at the same time, I do think that some ideas are likely to emerge, particularly if I think of frugal innovation, okay, as in Tata Motors, for instance. Ultra low-cost products and services that are world-class. And where they're ultra low-cost, not because of low labor cost, they're ultra low-cost because of radical innovations in product design or business model design. I think that is clearly a new approach to product innovation, to business model innovation, that is of Asian origin, not of Western origin. So that's an example. There may be others, for instance, corporate social responsibility. How to think of CSR, not just as a necessary evil, but as part of corporate fabric. I think that's more likely to come from Asia than from the West. So I can see potentially interesting ideas emerging from here and becoming global.
Okay, we'll have a last question. And Lucy. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, because time is here.
Thank you, Professor, for a very informative and illuminating lecture. I'm Lucy from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, formerly a student in Kuan Yew School. I have two questions for you. The first question is about the Indian-China bilateral trade. You mentioned that by the year of 2015, the Indian-China bilateral trade could be as big as US-China trade. I'm wondering what are the sectors that you would predict to have the most fastest growing trade, and also what are the comparative advantages between China and India? The second question is about the demography tax. You mentioned that in 10 years' time, China might pay a tax on demography because of its aging society. But what about India? Because people also predict that since China will have the family control, but India you don't have a similar policy, and in 10 years' time, probably 15 years' time, Chinese population will be smaller than Indian population. So do you see Indian will have a similar demography tax, but different one from China?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So the first question is about trade. I can see how trade is playing out in the current time frame. So not fully clear about how it will be playing out in 2015. But today what's happening is that bulk of China's exports to India are of capital goods, machinery. Because India has started the infrastructure revolution, the manufacturing revolution about 3-4 years back, what China started in 1995. And the infrastructure and manufacturing revolution, what it needs are two things, machinery and capital. Capital is not a problem. I mean, there is, trillions of dollars of money in the world floating around looking for good investment opportunities, whether it is Middle Eastern money or even Chinese money or certainly Singaporean money. But in terms of capital goods, yes, of course, India has its own capital goods industry, but India's domestic industry cannot produce what the market needs. And what Indian power plant companies, road building companies, what they're finding, they could buy from the European or American manufacturers, but they can buy from Chinese companies at 30 or 40% lower price. So actually, what China is doing is that by exporting large as in $32 billion for 2008 of capital goods to India, that China is becoming an enabler, an accelerator of India's infrastructure revolution, which of course in the longer run is going to make life tough for China, because as India's infrastructure gets better by Chinese help, if you will, because of lower cost capital goods, that India will become more competitive than China in manufacturing. But that story is playing out. What India by and large is exporting to China today is primary goods, iron ore, cotton, so things like that, because India really is very weak in manufacturing, so it cannot really export manufactured goods to China in any sizable amount. And India is very strong in IT services, but then because of language reasons, it's not really possible or easy for India to be exporting IT services to China. So that's how it's playing out. The second question was?
Demography.
Demography. See, it's like, China, clearly, of course, the one-child policy has done wonders in terms of the population growth rate. Of course, there are implications of the one-child policy for the aging of the population, for the male-female ratio and things like that. But leaving that aside, the Indian government, by and large, has done nothing in terms of family planning or control. Yeah, there are education efforts, to educate people and so on. But by and large, I'm not too worried about it. And the reason I'm not too worried about it is because if you look at the data on birth rates, fertility and so on, birth rates in India, they are dropping rapidly. Because as people get more educated, as people become wealthier, even in the rural areas, they themselves have fewer children. So for instance, the population growth rate in India currently is running at about 1.2% a year. If you go back 10 years back, it was 1.7, 1.8% a year. Population growth rate in China is 0.7% a year. So it's not that China's population is not growing, but it's growing at 0.7, India at about 1.2, 1.3. And as India continues to get more educated, as becomes richer, that 1.2 will drop. And so therefore, this is what I would say a self-correcting problem, because ultimately what matters for a country is not how many people it has, but really what is the per capita income and what happens to the growth of that income, And it's much easier for the government, particularly in a democratic country like India, to figure out how to have policies in place that would make the economy grow at, say, 8% rather than 7.5%, than to figure out what measures to put in place to bring the population growth rate down from 1.2% to 0.7%. So my own perspective is forget about population control because it's a self-correcting problem, and focus on economic growth, focus on education.
Okay, and thank you so much. We know the people still have questions, but you have a better schedule. Let's.
On behalf of the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and SAI Singapore, we would like to extend our sincere gratitude to both Professor Anil Gupta and Professor Huang Jing for providing us valuable insights on a very interesting subject. Thank you, sir. What we'd like to do is have the two books there. Professor Gupta, would you please give the two books? One for Professor Huang. And we have a copy for Professor Mehbubani. If Colonel Chopra, if you can kindly come forward. May I now request SAI Chairman, Mr. Karan Singh Sakral, to come forward and present some tokens of appreciation to Professor Anil Gupta and Professor Huang.
Oh, thank you. I've been like secretary. Small people size. Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
I'd like to thank the team at Lee Kuan Yew School, John Wiley, and all my fellow members at SAI Singapore for helping organize this event. With that, we come to the end of this part of the program. There are some refreshments and there's a networking session down at the Students' Lounge, which is on the ground level. John Wiley has also arranged for a book sale, Getting China and India Right. It's available at a 20% discount today. And Professor Gupta has kindly agreed to sign the books that are bought today. So please join us for the refreshments downstairs. And we look forward to you attending some of our other events in the future. Thank you very much.